This week on The Sceptic, I speak to James Graham, Senior Researcher on Financial Freedoms at the Prosperity Institute, on the scourge of ESG and why your pension fund is funding net zero and costing you money in the process.
They invest billions in green infrastructure because they have money coming to them in the form of taxpayer-funded subsidies. And the reality is, in 2029, if we get a government of the right who scraps these subsidies, every single one of these investments is going to be wiped out.
Now, pension funds are supposed to help people set aside some money for their retirement and hopefully generate a return. But it turns out many of them are more interested in political causes like net zero than with safeguarding our investments. So why is that? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by James Graham, who is a senior researcher on financial freedoms at the Prosperity Institute and a writer for publications including The Spectator. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Laura. It's great to be here.
Yeah, really good to have you here. So this politicization of finance and pension funds is a broad thing, but you've written about this in particular in relation to legal in general and its obsession with net zero. And so, well, tell us a bit about that. And I suppose it's a strange thing for them to be doing, to be obsessed with this political cause when you'd think they would just be trying to make money.
Yeah, no, thank you, Laura. You are, of course, completely correct. It's a very strange thing for them to do. When any of us save into our pensions, we expect the managers to focus on maximising returns, making sure that we can have a healthy income in retirement. But unfortunately, almost every pension fund manager in Britain and every bank is signed up to net zero goals. They are obsessive. Net zero by 2050. For some of them, it's even net zero by 2040 or even 2030. And all of this really is rooted in what I describe as the ESG scam, which traces its roots back to the early 2000s, but really got going after the great financial crash when banks had to sanitize their reputation and they embraced what they saw as social and environmental good over profit-seeking. Profit was very out of fashion. And the rise of this since 2008, 2009 has coincided with the rise of climate alarmism, as we have seen, and perhaps that is not a coincidence, as a lot of ESG money has been funneled towards environmental lobby groups. And fundamentally, this is bad for investors and it's bad for pension savers. It undermines their returns and makes them less well off in their retirement. We need pension funds to reprioritise their clients and, frankly, to ensure that people can have healthy incomes in their retirements. They can spend time with their grandchildren, maybe take an occasional holiday. And all of that is being put at risk by this net zero alarmism, which has captured these institutions.
And you make a very important point that, yes, some of these fund managers may be interested in this, but many of their actual investors won't. And these are very politicized topics.
No, that's completely correct. You mentioned Legal in General in your last question. I attended the Legal in General AGM. And after the AGM, we had lunch with some of the senior members of the Legal and General team. And I was quite struck speaking to them. I put to them the fact that most people in the country, with the rise of reform, the shifting position of the Conservatives, no longer support net zero. And they insisted that they did, and this is what their clients wanted. But fundamentally, this just reflects the capture of human resources of so much of the private sector. When people's pensions are invested, it's no longer them making the decisions really. Workplace pension decisions are made by HR departments who are generally net zero ESG obsessed, but are not reflective of the general workforce. And this leads to these managers thinking that the underlying investors are also obsessed when they're not. And the managers, like Legal in General, then leverage. Legal in General has over £1 trillion under its management, and currently is weaponising this money to force private companies to adopt net zero policies, to defund oil and coal companies, and to make the country less well off. The underlying pensioners do not want this, and the underlying owners of capital need to challenge these managers. They need to write letters. They need to raise their voices and tell them that time is up.
And so you make another important point that not only is this a political cause that not everyone will be on board with and that it's already costing them money, but also the fact that it's a very political and politicised cause means that actually it carries a significant extra amount of risk, because actually it's depending a lot on government subsidies, and therefore it's downstream of politics.
Yeah, no, that's right. We have these fund managers who they make the case that whilst they want to achieve net zero, there actually is no trade-off at all because it achieves higher returns. But this completely ignores the fact that their entire investment philosophy is reliant on this net zero consensus, which is crumbling really fast beneath their feet. And this is something I pointed out to Legal in General, and I've been trying to highlight as much as possible. They invest billions in green infrastructure, as they call it. I don't think there's anything green about it personally. They build wind turbines, solar panels, they vandalize our countryside, and all of it because they have money coming to them in the form of contracts for different renewable obligations, taxpayer-funded subsidies. And the reality is, in 2029, if we get a government of the right who scraps these subsidies, every single one of these investments is going to be wiped out almost immediately. And this isn't an abstract thing. I mean, one example that comes to mind is Marks and Spencer's, who have Marks and Spencer's. It's a relatively small pension fund that manages the pensions on behalf of Marks and Spencer's employees. It's currently invested in over 100 solar farms in Britain. Billions of pounds in solar farms. It's unbelievable. That's not in the interest of Marks and Spencer's employees in the first place, I would argue. But when that gets wiped out, if it does get wiped out, I mean, it's terrible for the pensioners. It's money which they're using, and of course it costs the managers nothing. They get green credentials and get invited to nice dinner parties, but real people lose out.
And one key question that many of our viewers will have is why are the fund managers doing this? So is it on the one hand that there are all these regulations which are pushing them towards net zero, or is it rather that the fund managers themselves are actually quite fanatical about this? Now, you had a really interesting anecdote. So after you raised this at the AGM, you went to lunch with some of the managers, and you were making the very basic point, really, that actually this is going to be bad for their bottom line. And they were almost looking at you like you were from another planet. I mean, so tell us a bit about their mindset, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of divergence in the mindset amongst the managers. I think there are some of them who are what you might describe as proper fanatics. And there were some, I said to them, I basically asked what return they would be willing to sacrifice in order to achieve their environmental goals. And the response I got, I'm paraphrasing, but it was essentially any sacrifice in returns is acceptable, because if we don't pursue net zero, the world will end, and therefore nothing else will matter. So we need to do this. However, I did speak to others who I challenged them on the net zero consensus. I pushed back a little bit on it, and it was quite obvious they had never really dealt with any of these arguments. They're in somewhat of a bubble. And what I kind of think of it as on these company boards is you could almost describe it as the private sector blob. It's kind of public sector thinking which is being imported into these big pension funds and these big public companies. And that has happened because there's been so much regulation. There's been so much pressure applied to them by these ESG lobby groups, who, by the way, are often involved in the regulation and are advocating for the regulation. And at this stage, lots of the managers, I mean, they're not really free-thinking individuals. They're just there to enforce whatever the latest trend and regulatory diktat is, essentially. Which is why the best people in the industry are no longer trying to be on these boards, or they're no longer trying to work for these public companies. They're either leaving the country or they're trying to start exciting startups. That's where the energy is. But we need to deregulate and attract those people back to these big companies that are managing money on behalf of us all.
So clearly some people are very wedded to this agenda still, some less so. But obviously the political sands are shifting very rapidly in America and here maybe in future. And so to some extent it does seem that the financial world is taking notice. And so there's the particular example of the recent Glasgow financial agreement on net zero. And that's sort of coming apart. I suppose, well, tell us what that is in the first place and what's changing now.
So I mentioned earlier that ESG really got going after the great financial crash, but you could say it got put on rocket boosters in 2021 during COP21 in Glasgow, which I'm sure you remember. At that time, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero was founded, and that was founded by our favourite Bank of England governor, Mark Carney, and it essentially was an umbrella organisation for all financial institutions. And every financial institution which signed up had to commit to various things. It had to commit to net zero by 2050. And by the way, if that was net zero by 2050, just in that private businesses' operations, we might say, okay. But the problem in the financial sector is that all of these institutions own other companies. They own stakes in small private enterprises, and the commitments that they entered through the Glasgow Alliance oblige them to force every portfolio company to also go net zero. So it's essentially social environmental engineering on a mass scale. And every bank, and well, until recently, every bank in Britain is a member of this. Pretty much every major fund manager is a member of this. And the same goes for most of Europe, all of whom have banks who are members. However, thankfully, this alliance has begun to fall apart. Since probably approximately a year ago, even before the election of Trump, lots of big American banks have been pulling out. Lots of American asset managers have been exiting because fundamentally they've realized that they cannot tie themselves to a treaty, to an agreement which obliges them to prioritize a secondary goal in net zero over and above their primary goal, which is making their investors as rich as possible, which is the goal and should be the goal. And recently, we've seen in Britain about 2 weeks ago, HSBC became the first British bank to pull out. And this is really exciting. We need more British banks and more British fund managers to be brave and to exit the alliance and to send that signal to the market that this will not stand. And HSBC's withdrawal, that was especially significant because they were actually a founding member. But I do think that the sands are shifting, and this is an exciting time. There's still a lot of work to do, especially in Britain, and HSBC does, on paper, remain committed to net zero by 2050. But this is an important signal that the Glasgow Financial Alliance is crumbling. They claim to be restructuring, but the details on this are pretty limited. And it's clear it's just an attempt to retain some credibility amongst the flood of banks trying to get as far as they can from it.
And would it be fair to say that this green finance is really a bubble that has depended on politics and subsidies, as we said, and that it's probably soon going to burst?
Yeah, I think that is correct. You have two elements really. So you have the environmental and net zero investment element, which is actually investment in what they refer to as the green or even the just transition, which is building solar farms, wind turbines, and all the rest of it. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people, that is completely a bubble. That does not exist except for government subsidy. In Britain, at least, no renewable energy has ever competed on the free market and succeeded. And the moment the rug of subsidy is pulled from under its feet, that industry will collapse. And even in recent years, the returns on these assets has been falling through the floor. After the great financial crash, we had incredibly low interest rates, and it was possible to have these bad investments whilst maintaining reasonable returns. But in the high interest rate environment, it's essentially, there's nowhere to hide. These bad investments are being exposed, and over the last 5 years, they have returned incredibly poor results. So that's one element. The second element is the rest of the economy. You have a lot of stocks, a lot of companies, which are not energy stocks. They're just normal companies. And in recent years, their returns have been suppressed by the net zero agenda, by the fact that these big investment companies have been forcing them to allocate money to achieving net zero. Every pound which has been spent by private companies trying to achieve net zero could have been either returned to shareholders to make the British people better off, or allocated to growing that business to provide better services and more services for the British people. That hasn't happened, so you could almost describe that element as the opposite of a bubble. And when this collapses, there's going to be a real opportunity for growth, and a lot of money will re-enter the useful British economy.
Yes, that's very interesting. And as you've been saying, finance has been directed away from useful areas and towards net zero. And one example of that you've been writing about recently, that's rather ironic in a way, is that suddenly the British political class took notice a few months ago that actually it's very hard for defence, particularly because of ESG, to raise capital. And well, tell us a bit about that. But, has that really crippled our ability to properly finance the defence industry?
Yes, it has, and this is something which has only really come into public attention because of the war in Ukraine. If that war hadn't happened, who knows how long we would have continued down this path. Almost every ESG fund, and in Great Britain, at least half of funds have ESG criteria. Almost every ESG fund excludes defence. So that means they will not provide equity or debt to the defence industry. And for private companies to grow, for private defence firms to grow, they need access to capital. To develop new products, they need access to capital. And it's basic economics that when you constrict the availability of that capital, as ESG does, it then becomes more expensive for the defence firms to access capital. And as it becomes more expensive for the defence firms to access capital, this then pushes up the overall costs for those defence firms. And the knock-on impact of that is the taxpayer paying more to procure vital military equipment needed to fund the defence of the nation. So it's a real scandal. And I mean, perhaps the sharpest edge of this is the Parliamentary Pension Fund, which I recently exposed as excluding the defence industry. About the majority of the equity invested through the Parliamentary Pension Scheme, which is the pension invested on behalf of MPs, currently excludes the defence industry, which is just crazy. And I think the real hypocrisy of the ESG scam, which is illustrated through the exclusion of defence, is you have funds which exclude great British defence firms, yet are willing to invest in companies operated by our adversaries. So, for example, the parliamentary fund I'm thinking of, which excludes defence, includes, for example, ByteDance, which is a Chinese software company which is used to spy on the Chinese people and citizens overseas. And the British Parliamentary Pension Scheme is happy to invest in that, whilst it won't invest in British defence. It's mad. We need to change the narrative on defence. We need to remind people that defence is an ethical investment and fund it. And I mean, the sad thing is that this is not just bad for the country, but it's actually bad for individual pensioners. Over the last 5 years, because of the geopolitical environment, big defence stocks have outperformed the rest of the market by multitudes. You're talking tenfold returns compared to the FTSE 100, say. BAE has skyrocketed, and most people in the country have not benefited from that because of ESG.
And another way that those really perverse incentives were highlighted this year was when we had a letter from 100 Labour MPs to the finance industry saying, well, you need to take down the barriers towards investing in defence. And of course, these really have been erected by Parliament, by politicians over a number of years. I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's completely ridiculous. I think these Labour MPs are so out of touch. All of the incentives which encourage firms to prioritise ESG, they've been created A, by Parliament, and B, by the SCA and other regulators, which, the Chancellor, she gets to set the remit of the SCA, so she could tell them off the bat, defence is ethical, ESG is harming the economy, invest in defence and deprioritise ESG. But they're not going to try to do this because it's too difficult and they don't want to confront it. It's easier to write letters and to look good and impress the general public, but actually they're the ones with questions to answer. And the fact that their pension fund is actually invested in defence kind of is illustrative of the whole problem. People don't realise that they have ownership of stocks through their pensions. Most people, apparently including the people we've elected to represent us, don't understand that they have a pension which is invested in physical assets, and that those assets are funding or defunding different industries in the country, and that they are being used to advocate an agenda. And I mean, it is perhaps nowhere more clear than with the parliamentary pension scheme that it's advocating an agenda which its members oppose. And if that's true of the parliamentary pension scheme, just think of every workplace pension scheme across the country and what it could be happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. And obviously, we're in dire financial straits as an economy at the moment. And in economics, there's that adage, isn't there? There's no such thing as a free lunch. But actually, it sounds like if we just got rid of all of this ESG stuff, and in particular, as you've been saying, enabled ourselves to invest in these actually quite productive industries that we've been constricting investment into, well, then actually, that could be a quick win for the economy and for Rachel Reeves.
Yeah, no, I think that's completely correct. Rachel Reeves, she has no money to spend. Her only lever to pull is regulatory reform, and stripping ESG out of the British system would perhaps be one of the most growth incentivizing actions she could take. The reality is companies want to seek profit. The city wants profit. We pretend that they want ESG. Some managers do, as I mentioned, there are fanatics, but largely they've been incentivized and beaten into submission. We need to set them free. We need to strip ESG out of the system. Tell them that prioritizing profit is their goal. And actually, as free market individuals, we believe that profit is a social good, and that when we pursue profit, capital will be allocated properly. The most productive industries will thrive. They in turn will benefit the most people, and so on. And actually, in the same way that we don't believe, sorry, I say we, I'm speaking for myself, in the same way that I don't believe the state is best placed to spend individuals' money, neither are the boards of these private companies. It shouldn't be for the ESG directors at Legal in General to decide which charitable causes shareholders' money should be spent on. That money should be returned to the shareholders, and the shareholders who are closer to their local communities can then decide where to spend that money, and it will be inherently more effectively allocated. That's a basic economic truth that most people can grasp. Those closer to the problem understand it better.
So we've had entire productive industries denied finance, but there's also the fact that banking services are being denied to individuals, often for political reasons, and that's the phenomenon of debanking. So, well, where did this debanking come from, and what can be done about it?
Debanking is a scandal which has been going on in Britain for at least 8 years, probably longer. The issue got blown open in 2023 when a major bank in Britain decided to debank Nigel Farage. They pretended it was on a technicality around the money he had or the money he didn't have, but they quickly got found out. It was clear that it was politically motivated debanking. And this opened the floodgates. Immediately there was an array of different stories of individuals who had been debanked for essentially doing nothing wrong except expressing their opinions, standing up for what they believed in, maybe working in the wrong job or the wrong sector. And all of this a lot of it can be traced back to 2017, when there was a massive expansion of the financial crime regime, which placed huge pressure on banks to check that every single customer they provided banking services to was kosher, essentially, and that every client had no involvement in any financial crime. They had to complete a huge amount of due diligence on each customer. And I mean, it's worth pointing out off the bat that this imposed a huge cost on banks of over 30 billion. I believe the amount being spent on financial crime by banks is currently double the British policing budget, which in itself is crazy. However, what this has done is it's given cover to banks to debank people who are essentially don't share their political beliefs or their political leanings or ideologies. There are some legitimate debankings insofar as if somebody has a low value in their bank account and the bank has to spend the high amount doing the due diligence, there's a level in which you can see the logic from the bank's perspective in closing down their account. But I mean, I don't think that's acceptable, and I think we need to massively roll back the 2017 regulations, which are yet to be shown to actually make any tangible difference on financial crime. So that's one piece. The second piece is that currently banks, when they debank people for political or ideological reasons, they do it from their perspective because they perceive there to be a reputational risk from providing services to these individuals. We need to make sure that there is at least as great a reputational risk by denying them services. So we need to take the statistics. The year that Nigel Farage was debanked, he was one of over 400,000 people debanked. Most of those names remain completely anonymous. They shouldn't. We should take those stories and we should leverage them to embarrass the policymakers and to embarrass the banks. And watch this space because the Prosperity Institute is doing some interesting work in this area. One element of this scandal which has been slowly uncovered is also in relation to the defence sector. So the defence sector is currently being hit on two fronts. The ESG scam is really hurting the defence sector when it comes to the big primes and to the big players who are being denied capital. However, a huge amount of our defence sector is reliant on small companies, micro enterprises, supplying small components. 75% of defence SMEs have experienced debanking. They've had their bank accounts closed down and had to go from bank to bank begging for another account. That process takes months. It's obviously a scandal and it's making us less safe as a nation. If the government could do anything immediately, they should prioritise defence firms. Surely we have a land war in Europe, and they should tell the banks that it's in the interest of national security to make it as easy as possible for a defence firm to have a bank account. At the moment, all of us are being put at risk by this practice, and it's just the defence industry, which is literally currently in the process of rearming Britain, is being repeatedly battered over the head by ESG and by debanking, both at the same time.
So on the one hand, they're being denied capital from the big financiers, but also they're literally being denied the opportunity to put their own money in a bank. I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah, no, that's right. And as your listeners understand, you literally cannot run a business without a bank account. So when these bank accounts get closed down, operations freeze for a period of time. They can't take new orders. They can't receive payments. Everything freezes. It's hard to believe, to be honest.
Absolutely. Well, it's time we push back on it. James Graham, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
And that's it for this episode of The Sceptic. Thanks for watching, and see you again next week.